Hi everyone, I am Josh, and welcome back to my channel. It has been over a month since I last posted, but I'm back. I won't fixate on the fact that I haven't posted. No one cares about that. We're here, I'm posting, the place is a bit of a mess, I'm getting ready to move again. But today, I want to finally bring to y'all my list of backlist books of the 2000s that I want to read or that I think you should read. I've alluded to this list before. I have two backlist videos from earlier in the year of TBRs, each 10 books long from the 80s and 90s, and then from before the 80s back through antiquity. This one I'm doing a bit differently because, well, the list I made before, I've already read part of it, and honestly, I didn't like a lot of the books that I read. Also, I'm finding myself thinking more about backlist books, and so what the books I want to read are constantly changing. So I want to make a smaller list moving forward of books that I want to read for backlist book, but I'm rambling, so let's focus. Today I'm going to give you 10 books total. 5 recent reads that I read from the published in the 2000s, and then 5 more books that I want to read, hopefully by the end of the year, that are published in the 2000s. Some of them are from the original list. I'll point those out, and others are just new ones that I've thought about. Without further ado, let's get straight into the 5 books I want to recommend to you that are published in the 2000s that I think you should give a shot. We're going to be going in reverse chronological order. Starting published in 2007, we have Nixon Land. Oh shoot, I don't know the author's name. Either way, the cover is here. This is a nonfiction historical book looking at the rise of Nixon, both as he runs for president the first time against, I think, is it JFK? He loses before he runs again against Johnson and then officially takes office. I'd say about half the book is just leading up to him getting more attention, more power in the party and the country before he eventually takes office. And that's about the halfway point in the book. The rest is his term and a half or whatever that he actually served and about his time. I was surprised at how much I loved this book. I read it partly because of the election. I'm reading a bunch of election books that weren't originally on my TBR, but it has a lot of contrast to modern day when you think about LBJ dropping out at the last second, just a month or two before Biden did, relative to the election. Also, when you have third-party candidates, a new candidate coming up really fast, it's just a really fascinating contrast. And of course, Nixon himself being very Trump-like in a lot of ways. So that is all there. It's very fascinating. So you have this sort of the election side, but also the presidency side. Obviously, we've seen Trump as president. Nevertheless, this was just a really compellingly written book. Super long, I think over 600 pages. But I just ate it all up. It was such a great historical nonfiction book that really touches on the atmosphere of the time. While it does center on Nixon, it's not just a biography of Nixon. It is very much painting a picture of the time period that we're in, and it feels very well realized. It is a little dated, but just keep that in mind. In general, though, I thought it stood up really well. A book published in 2007. Okay, next up next up in this list of 5 books, we have Demon Theory, published in 2006 by Stephen Graham Jones. This is one of the many books I read by Stephen Graham Jones that I really appreciated for the style, the experimental nature of it, even if I felt like the experimental nature made the book itself perhaps not as easy to enjoy, but still extremely satisfying. This book, as along with other books by him, I think really highlights or just demonstrates sort of the path he was towards his Jade trilogy, the Angel of Indian Lake trilogy, and the homages to horror while also just making some really creative indigenous horror. And this is effectively like the Jade trilogy itself, a trilogy of films that are all condensed into this one book. In the book, if I remember correctly, it reads like a screenplay. I'm fairly certain it is. It's not like just every line as if you're reading straight from the screenplay, but it is simply outlined like that. And you have like this first book where you have these people having to deal with some, I think, supernatural horror, and they defeat it, and you move on to the sequel. And I liked it in the same way I liked the Jade trilogy, in the sense that each book is really distinctly different from the last. Like, it's continuing the story, but I'm impressed at how much it's not just a repeat, which is honestly more creative than you see in a lot of horror, even horror of the 80s and 90s that he's actually alluding to. And I want to highlight this book as something I don't hear a lot about, and also just remind people that Stephen Graham Jones has a pretty large backlog, dating pretty far back, and so maybe it's worth giving it a shot. Yes, it is experimental. Still, I think it's worth giving some attention to, especially if you really liked Angel of Indian Lake. This is just another way of looking at his love of the genre and of horror films in general. Next up, we're at 2006 again with varieties of scientific experience, another nonfiction book, this time by Carl Sagan. This is a series of lectures presented as essays that were published after his death, which I think was a decade before this. And part of the reason I'm including this is because, again, I was kind of surprised. I wasn't expecting to love this as much as I did. It's one of those things where I like Carl Sagan. I'm basically reading as much of his backlist as I can. I was just very, very pleasantly surprised at the conversations he's having here. The series of lectures are each sort of, if I remember correctly, they're sort of themed around different subjects, starting with just some basic introduction to astronomy and planetary science. But then he sort of just moves forward with things that intersect with spirituality and religion and sort of space travel or other space sciences. He talks about things like the fact that we exist at all in a universe that's as chaotic as it is, the possibility of I think, a God, or the way in which we sort of limit ourselves when we think about God, or rather, oftentimes when God is talked about, as opposed to all the infinite number of ways that God could actually exist that we never consider. Then there's things like alien life, alien contact. I feel like I'm not, sorry, there's a bug, not conveying it as well as I remember. I have a vlog recently, I think it was my last video, the one that I posted and didn't post anything else. It's on there, I talk about it. I really like this. I thought it was just a very thoughtful series of essays. And honestly, because they're lectures, I think they're a bit more accessible than a normal essay, because when you're talking to people, generally, I think you have to prepare what you're saying in a way that's not quite as difficult to interpret. Moving back to fiction, we have The Good House by Tanner Reeve Dew, published in 2003. This is horror. I did originally read this back in 2020, but I reread this year and very happy I did. I loved it even more than the first time. And this is one that gets a lot of attention, and rightfully so. This is a haunted house story in the vein of, I think, really some Stephen King homage feelings there, but it looks at this haunted house, this family history that has some connections, if I remember correctly, to, is it voodooism? Basically, this family getting involved with a devil or a demon of some type, and sort of leading to some generational trauma, and this woman trying to reckon with that with this house and the way it's sort of all sort of tied into this one house where she grew up, and reckoning with that. It's really well done. The entire thing is just really very compelling horror. Again, I think Tanner Reeve Dew does pull on some of the best things about Stephen King, while also, I think, exceeding what he does in a lot of ways of making much more thoughtful horror in the themes she's looking at and the things she's talking about. And it's definitely plenty to love here as a horror book, but also when it comes to wanting a book that actually has some significant things to say. And I really loved this book. Definitely recommend, as others have, I'm sure. And then another fiction for my last recommendation here. We have Stories of Your Life, published 2002 by Ted Chiang, his first short story collection. This here was on my original backlist of the 2000s TBR. And again, part of the reason I'm redoing this video is because I've already read it. And I would rather recommend this to you than just show it to you and tell you something I might want to read. So that way I can tell you how it definitely deserves to be read. This was just as good, if not better, than his most recent, probably more popular short story collection of science fiction and fantasy. It's just extremely thoughtful. I believe, if I remember correctly, these also have, and the same as his most recent short story collection, these also have a sort of short discussion at the end of his thought process going into that. I might be remembering this incorrectly. But either way, they're all very thoughtful. I think they look at some common tropes in some ways, especially when it comes to religion, in a way that I think is just very insightful and is really thought-provoking, as well as just a very compelling form of short fiction. Probably, arguably, my favorite speculative short fiction writer today. There we have it. Those are the 5 recommendations. Let's now move on. Now, 5 books that I still want to read, hopefully this year. Although I'll be honest, I'm not sure if I'll get to all of them this year, especially since I'm traveling all of November. But either way, we're going to again go chronological from most recently published to the oldest. Starting with The Black Hole War, published in 2008. Black Hole Wars, rather, by Leonard Susskind. He is a physicist who basically had a debate with Stephen Hawking about the nature of black holes and what happened to them, and I guess the nature of reality. I don't want to get too deep into the details here because without reading it, I don't know what it's about. It's something I've been wanting to read. It was on the original backlist TBR that I made for this. The fact that it's on here is because I'm still paying attention to the TBRs I'm making, but I'm not necessarily get through all of them by the end of the year. And this is one that I've I think I bought on Audible. It was on a sale, and I intend to read this. If maybe not before Halloween, because I'm sort of getting into Halloween mode of reading books, but definitely if not then so probably sometime in November or December. Nonfiction November is coming up. With that said, let's move on to the next one, which is horror, published in 2008. We have Pandemonium by Daryl Gregory. This one says, "It is in a world like our own in every aspect, except in the 1950s, random acts of possession began to occur." Blah, blah, blah. I don't want to get to it, so you get the gist. This is pretty short, actually. I think 200-ish pages. Published 2008, I think I said that. And this was on my original TBR of books that I just happened to come across at first. And I'm not sure if I would have kept it here if I hadn't found it on sale on Audible and I bought it. So I've downloaded it, and I probably will be reading this in October. That's why I decided to keep it on here. I think of the backlist TBR books that I had never heard of before I made the list, this is the one I'm most likely to actually pick up. With that said, let's move on to The Vegetarian by Hong Kong, published in 2007. This is one that I've heard of and I actually had wanted to read, but never really gave much thought to, mostly just because of the infinite number of books that I want to read. This is a horror book. Before the nightmare, Yong Hai and her husband lived an ordinary life, but when splintering, blood-soaked images start haunting her thoughts, she decides to purge her mind and renounce eating meat. I've heard this is really weird and unnerving horror. And because it's getting towards Halloween, and because it was already on my radar, I thought this is actually something I want to commit to reading in the next few months for the Halloween season. And needless to say, this was not on my original backlist TBR. Next up, we have one published in 2004, 1,006 pages, just so long. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norwell. One that I've heard great things about and that I want to read. I get really iffy when it comes to honestly anything set in the 1800s and the sort of what's it called, Victorian England. I think that's what it is, 1806. But at the same time, it's just one that's so popular. But also, I also really want to read Susanna Clark's newest book, and I feel weird picking up her newest one. I haven't read the last one. And this is one I think I had a good chance of liking. It's definitely in the genre I like. It's just the setting coupled with the fact that it's just kind of old. I haven't picked it up. Also, the audiobook narrated by a very British narrator that I don't much care for. But there is a new one supposedly coming out according to Audible. We'll see whether or not it's an actual new one or just a republication of the same one. I get a little irked when I do shit like that. But still, this is one that I am really hoping to get to this year. Probably in December, if I'm being honest. Well, I guess it could fit in the October vibe. We'll see. And then we have, is this the last one? No, yeah, it is the last one. Number 5 of the last one on my TBR, we have published in 2001, Erasure by Percival Everett. And this is an author who I've actually heard a lot about recently. One, you had the new film last year, one of the best of, an award-winning film last year called American Fiction, starring Jeffrey Wright and others. And one, I watched that movie this year. Unfortunately, couldn't watch it last year because it wasn't out in Australia yet, and I loved it. It was a very thoughtful and comedic. I knew it would be, but it was also, I think, a very heart-wrenching story, a very heartwarming story in the way that I didn't expect. If you don't know what that book or movie is about, it's about this writer who focuses a lot on his African American identity, or either he might write stories where that is a part of it, but he is very judgmental towards the stereotypes that are often highlighted in fiction. And when he basically gets irked by all of the major publishers wanting just generic stuff that he doesn't feel is appropriate or worthy of publication, he writes what he sees as a sort of satirical take or mocking take on that form of fiction. And it blows up. And he starts getting super popular, winning awards. And he has to decide how long is he going to go on with this farce versus just calling it out for what he thinks it is. And it's an interesting critique of that genre, or of that aspect of fiction, while also, I think, being an interesting conversation about the way in which some people are quick to be judged for what they write and the perspective they may have in writing that way. That is to say that he compares himself to another black writer who writes in a form that he sees as less than. And it was a very thought-provoking book. And Percival Everett also, I think, came out with a new book this year, I think it was. So it got a lot of popularity, being, was it Huckleberry Finn, but from, is it Jim? Is that his name? Jim's character's perspective. It was other character in the original story, but given that alternate perspective. And I've actually only heard good things. And that's where I think I first got exposed to this author before I ended up watching a movie. Still, Percival Everett is now someone that I'm actually highly anticipating. And while it does not fit into the October season, this is one that I actually do highly prioritize when it comes to the 2000s. So anyways, that's that. Those are the 5 books that I'm prioritizing from the 2000s. At least for now, we'll see. My mind goes all over the place. But I feel like for this decade, I've been had time to really reflect on the books I want to read since I've originally had this idea for this project. So I feel pretty good about settling on these 5 as the ones I'm prioritizing. I do have a lot more I want to read. If I remember, I will try to link to my Goodreads TBR or TBR link that I have of all the books published in the 2000s that are interesting to me. And from there, you can find my other publication year list that I have on Goodreads if you're interested. With that said, I would love to hear what books from the 2000s you think are worth reading. What books should I be considering that I haven't mentioned here? Maybe I'm already considering them. I don't know, but I would love your input here. This is going to be a hopefully ongoing project where I continue to try and prioritize backlist books that are worthy of attention that I might otherwise not give attention to just because of the flashiness of the new. It's about trying to find a balance, not saying one is superior to the other, but rather just recognizing when I have a bias towards one, which I think a lot of us do. And I just don't think I'm judgy towards myself and others, let's be honest. But that's fine. Who cares what I think? Either way, would still appreciate to hear any suggestions anybody has. With that said, thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll be back before or in under a month, unlike last time. Still, glad to be back. I hope you enjoyed the video and hope you have a great day. Goodbye, everyone.